Hello. Welcome to episode 2 of the English Journeys podcast, as we set off on the next leg of our Borderland journey to discover and linger in the pretty town of Ledbury. The road down the long, tree-clad western slopes of the Malvern Hills takes us through ancient woodland. These are woods which date back hundreds of years, a reminder of the great forests, the wild wood of prehistory, and remind us too of what we have lost in recent times, the destruction of our woodlands, our ancient trees of beech and ash and oak, and the loss of the wildlife which made them their homes. But there is still wildness here, and you can see bright green woodpeckers and noisy jays flying overhead, and at night owls are a flash of white caught in a car's headlights. Emerging from the woods, we roll and wind over the gentle hills and valleys of these western outliers of the Malvern Hills, and then we cross the railway line, and cresting a rise and passing the road to Eastner, and Robert Smirke's spectacular romantic tour de force at Eastner Castle, we begin to drop down into the Leaden Valley and to Ledbury itself. Ledbury is the main town in eastern Herefordshire. It's a busy, picturesque and charming place, and it's a real centre for its surrounding rural communities, and it's a wonderful place to explore. The town is full of little alleyways, entrances, hidden yards and back lanes, in which you can stumble across some of Ledbury's many cafes and boutiques. Because Ledbury is a brilliant place to shop. It's full of intriguing, imaginative, independent stores. And a few years ago, in a moment of madness, the Guardian newspaper, one of the UK's main national newspapers, nominated Ledbury as one of the 10 best places for Christmas shopping in Europe. Europe. I mean, not the West Midlands or even England, but Europe. I'm not sure that it can really compete with Paris or Bologna, but it is fun, and it's small enough to look around in half a day. The town is an increasingly important cultural centre too, and it has strong literary associations. This was the childhood home of the poet and novelist John Masefield. His famous magical children's books, The Midnight Folk and The Box of Delights, are set in the country areas around Ledbury. I remember reading them and being absolutely transported by his descriptions of the stark moonlit night landscapes, the wonder of thick snow, and the terrifying description of wolves running alongside the carriages of the railway train as it rattles along towards Ledbury. And this penetration of other worlds into our reality and our normality is made all the more haunting by knowing that these landscapes are here, they're all around us, they're real, and we can experience them now. The poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning's family home, Hope End, is just a couple of miles to the north, where she wrote many of her early works and spent her life before the family moved to Wimpole Street in London and her marriage to the poet Robert Browning. And the town was a focus for the Dimmock group of poets, notably Robert Frost and his friends Edward Thomas and Rupert Brooke, who wrote loving, sometimes heartbreaking hymns to an English pastoral world disappearing in the face of the march of modernity and, ultimately, the horrors of the First World War. And their rural idyll was ripped apart by the arrival of war in 1914. It was a war which sent Robert Frost back to his native America and Edward Thomas and Rupert Brooke to their deaths. Before he enlisted in 1915, Thomas wrote one of his most famous poems, and one of my favourites, after a train journey from London Paddington to Malvern, as he was travelling down to visit Robert Frost, when his train was delayed at the little Gloucestershire village of Addlestrop. And it goes like this. Yes, I remember Addlestrop, the name, because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there unwontedly. It was late June. The steam hissed. Someone cleared his throat. No one left, and no one came on the bare platform. What I saw was Adelstrop, only the name, and willows, willow herb and grass, and meadow sweet and haycocks dry, no whit less still and lonely fair than the high cloudlets in the sky. And for that minute a blackbird sang close by, and round him, mistier, farther and farther, all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. Nowadays the town is becoming a new centre for poetry and a celebration of the spoken word, particularly through the Ledbury Poetry Festival, which is a brilliant 10 days held every year in early July. And the town is also ancient. It's very beautiful. There is a grand medieval hall on the high street, St. Catherine's Hall. But as you stand here, at the crossroads where the high street meets the south end, looking down towards the market house, perhaps the most striking thing, on first sight certainly, are the number of black and white timber-framed buildings. They can lean out crazily across the roads, almost looking as if they're going to tumble down into the street. And these are grand and imposing buildings. Behind you is a house called Ledbury Park, and really it's a small palace built for a rich textile merchant, Edward Skinner, in the 16th century. The rhythm of its close-studded facade is intended to impress both physically. I mean, it's right in your face. It's right on the very edge of the pavement, as if it's shouldering you out of the way. And to impress as well in its sheer extravagance. All that precious oak. It must have been phenomenally expensive when it was first built. And the walls comprise this mass, this tight rhythm of uprights, alternating with white infill. And it's quite startling. But all this detail isn't structural, it's just there to show off. And you can meet Edward Skinner himself and his wife Elizabeth on their life-size monument in the Church of St. Michael and All Angels. They are kneeling and wearing, as you would expect, the most fashionable clothes, and facing each other over the body of their little daughter, who died in infancy. But she was the only one. Their 10 surviving children are lined up below them, 5 boys and 5 girls. The Feathers Hotel, further down the high street on the left, is looser, more decorative, almost a kind of architectural black and white jazz, with its wonky roofline and upper stories which jut out over the street. No floor in the entire building is actually level. Everything is crazily out of true. And there are other great examples of this kind of medieval and Tudor building throughout the town. In fact, the town is essentially timber-built. Lots of buildings on the main streets have been fitted out in Georgian or Victorian times with smart brick and stucco facades. But the buildings behind their street frontages are essentially unchanged. They're still ancient timber-framed structures. And it's a style of building we'll encounter throughout our journey. And one of the exciting things about the English landscape and townscapes is the variety of building materials, the way in which places can assert their own visual identity. We tend to build our houses, our farms, barns, domestic buildings generally, out of materials which are readily to hand, according to our local geology. And that can mean anything from the beautiful and famous honey-coloured Cotswold stone, or chalk and flint in southern counties, coloured clay brick, or the dark millstone grits of the high Pennine Hills. But the lovely red sandstones of Herefordshire are not good building stone. They're too soft to keep out the weather, too crumbly to bear any weight. But what Herefordshire did have, still does have up to a point, is trees, and especially a wealth of wonderful oaks. And so even ambitious public buildings were constructed from oak framing, massive timber beams and trusses, the walls infilled with woven hazel wattles or split oak laths all covered in daub, kind of sticky mix made of clay, cow dung, wool and lime plaster. And it's amazing when you think of it that these buildings, made essentially from wood and mud, have been part of our landscape, part of our lives and histories for so many centuries, and they're still with us now. And that includes, of course, the market hall, or market house as it is known here, which stands in the centre of town. I mean, it's really just a great room held up on massive timber columns, linked to the marketplace by an elaborate carved staircase. And its building is attributed to a man called John Abel, a master of timber building, a brilliant carpenter, famous in his own day 400 years ago. And he's a local legend still, and we'll encounter other fine buildings and carvings by Abel on our journey. And a lot of his work still survives, which is lucky, really, and unexpected in many ways, because for much of his life he was a marked man. He was a Roman Catholic in an England which was increasingly and aggressively Protestant, and a royalist. In fact, he was the royal carpenter to the king. But this was at the beginning of a civil war which eventually saw King Charles beheaded and his supporters fined, imprisoned, or even executed. These were really dangerous times. As a royalist, let alone a Catholic royalist, you could lose everything. And we tend to romanticize our history in the tales of floppy-hatted, dashing royalist cavaliers, Prince Rupert charging into battle with his pet poodle riding pillion, and stern, well-armoured parliamentarian roundheads. And we forget the bitter hatred and murderous violence which swept through this country. And nowhere really lay at peace during this time. Even Ledbury didn't escape the fighting. Prince Rupert himself led a cavalry charge here which shattered a parliamentarian force in a short but bitter battle in April 1645. So life must have been incredibly difficult for Abel, living a cautious life, always worried about his and his family's safety. He'd already had to marry his childhood sweetheart, Joanna, in a secret Catholic ceremony, lying low until the return of the young King Charles II from exile in France. But somehow he still managed to create some of the finest timber buildings of the 17th century, especially in these western lands. And walking up the narrow, cobbled church walk just by the market house, you can feel that legacy of timber building. We can imagine past lives of Ledbury citizens as we pass on under overhanging stories, past shops, cafes, the Prince of Wales pub, to the Church of St. Michael and All Angels in all its Gothic beauty. It's been described as the most important church in Herefordshire, and it is a special building, speaking of the glory of medieval spirituality. And it's a wonderful example of medieval sculpture and architecture. The church is full of interest, lots of fine memorials, really beautiful sculpture, commemorating Ledbury worthies. But the north chapel is quiet, it's uncluttered. And standing in the centre, the structure, the clarity and rhythms of this Gothic marvel are borne in on you. It is a meditation on the capacity of architecture, its power to change the nature of our awareness. And there are unexpected treats here as well, real treasures, including an amazing painting of the Last Supper, Christ's last meal with his disciples before his betrayal and crucifixion, which was given to the church by the local Skip family in 1909. But what's so surprising about the picture is that it was produced by the workshop of the great Italian artist Titian, who certainly painted parts of it himself and signed it too. But the painting includes one of the very few portraits of Titian as a young man, so it's a really extraordinary thing. You simply don't expect to come across a major work by one of the most important Venetian studios of the 16th century in an English provincial church. And there is gorgeous stained glass here as well. High in the north wall is one of my favourite windows, a wonderful memorial to a member of the local gentry, Charles Palleray, by Christopher Wall, a master of stained glass and one of the greatest artists of the arts and crafts movement. It's easy to ignore stained glass. So often it can appear just as a bit of colour in the architecture of a building, as a filler for the windows. But it is a demanding art form which 100, 150 years ago was considered one of the most important of the visual arts. From the initial designs, the complete drawn cartoons, the selection and cutting of the coloured glass, the painting of surface and detail, it's a complex and demanding process. And in the hands of a great artist, as Wall was, it can be amazingly rewarding, creating powerful and beautiful works of art, but made in glass rather than paint. And every element of this window shimmers. Wall was using a thick slab glass specially made for stained glass work, and would touch even the plainest glass with soft enamel washes which give the whole window a kind of opalescent subtlety. So, look at it. We rarely give stained glass the time it deserves, the time it needs. But good stained glass, as we saw in Malvern, can transform our experience of a place. And the main subject here is fabulous. The figure of St. Michael the Archangel dominates the central light, his blue and purple wings reflected in the brilliant steel of his armour. He is tall, attenuated, almost meditative, as he drives the devil in the form of a squirming sapphire dragon out of heaven and down to the fires of hell. St. Michael is flanked by figures in the adjacent lights representing the virtues of fortitude and patience, while below are panels of love and comfort. In traditional imagery, certainly in the Middle Ages, the human soul was often represented in the form of a child. And here Wall has used that idea to show the soul as a young boy guided by childlike angels through the dangers of a thorny wasteland to heavenly safety. Charles Palleray was a local dignitary, politician and influential citizen, but he was also a soldier, a captain in a cavalry regiment, the 9th Queen's Royal Lancers, and I suppose that must have influenced the nature of the imagery in the window, the armoured and heroic St. Michael, flanked by the stern virtues of fortitude and patience. You don't think of stained glass as being a particularly radical art form, but by the early 20th century, some of the most exciting and ambitious works in stained glass were being produced by women artists, and it was almost a new feminist movement. Many of them were involved in political campaigns for women's suffrage, for Irish Home Rule. They were avowedly lesbian and were radical socialists. So just carrying this ancient art form into the modern world. And there is a lovely window by Christopher's daughter, Veronica Wall, who went on to become a very influential artist in her own right, just to the east of her father's work and illustrating the story of St. Martin. It will have taken months to make these windows, their colours, motifs and form, all the subject of thought and skill and care, and the least we can do is give them a couple of minutes of our time. But now it's time to go, leaving town and following the signs to Hereford, heading out towards Leominster and the north.